Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, happy Thursday to everyone. Welcome to this Church Facility Management Solutions webinar on Facing the Inevitable Lifecycle Planning. We are so happy that you have joined us today. Just some of the housekeeping stuff out first. If during the webinar you've got some specific questions or things that you might want answered, feel free to shoot those to us via the question pane through your control panel. We're glad to answer the questions as they come in and as we can work them in. We will make a recording of this webinar available on resources on CFMS. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can always reach us at cfms@coolsolutionsgroup.com. We're happy to hear that. And so, again, my name is Nathan Parr, Facility Specialist, Cool Solutions Group. Glad to have you. And our special guest today is Mr. Tim Cool, our Chief Solutions Officer with Cool Solutions Group. And Tim, we thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself and go ahead and share with us about life cycle planning.
Sounds great. Well, thank you, Nathan, and thank you everybody for joining us for this edition of the Church Facility Management Solutions monthly webinar. So, why do we call it Facing the Inevitable? Well, I'll get to that in just a moment. But for those of you who don't know me, and for some reason my slide deck is not moving now. There we go. My name is Tim Cool. That's my lovely family there on the screen, and some of the books that I've had an opportunity to author, and have been doing this in the church world for about 32 years. And so while I am not an expert in all things church facility, I have seen my fair amount of stuff. So hopefully I'll be able to share some of that with you that will help you in your local church setting. So again, why do we call it inevitable? Well, the reason we call it inevitable is these are not issues when we deal with capital reserves that are maybes or ifs. They're going to happen. It's a matter of if. It's a matter of when and how much. You will replace every air conditioning unit. You will replace all the carpet in your building at some point in time. So we're going to explore some of that today. But as we get started, we see there being 4 buckets of church facility management. When you're looking at setting up your buckets for your facility, there are 4 buckets. And so I'm going to hit on all 4 of them, but spend most of the time on the capital reserve piece. So the first bucket, when you're looking at how do you set up your budget for your church, is your operational bucket. So operations would include utilities, janitorial, general maintenance, and staff. Within the utilities, we find that most churches, if you're a 6 to 7 day a week facility, you're going to spend somewhere between $1 and $1.50 a square foot. So for those of you with your calculators handy, if you know your utility bill for the year and you know your square footage, you can do the math. And if you're in that $1 to $1.50 range, then you're in an acceptable range. $1.25 really should be more of the target. If you're over $1.50, then you probably have some inefficiencies that you need to look at. If you're under $1, either you are a superstar in efficiency or your facility might be underutilized. So just a couple things to keep your eye on. Janitorial costs. Think of labor, material, paper products, all your major cleanings. So you do carpet extraction so many times a year. You do window cleaning. You do other, if you will, spring cleaning type things. And so $1.75 to $2.50, and there's fair swings in this depending on, again, do you have a daycare, do you have a school? That's going to put you on the higher end. What is your level of clean? And for those of you who are members of CFMS, Nathan Parr developed a great tool that's in our resource section, a cleaning calculator that allows you to kind of set the amount of manpower you need to assigned to your cleaning based on the level of clean you're willing to accept, everything from a Motel 6 up to a Ritz-Carlton. The third is general maintenance. And the reason we're going over this operational piece is because 2 of the other buckets are reliant very heavily on general maintenance. The the general maintenance piece, we find anywhere from $2.50 to $3.50 a square foot is where facilities function the best at. And as you look at this, I can assure you that when Nathan and I do facility condition assessments for churches, if a church tells me they can't set money aside for capital reserves, but they're running $2 a square foot for utilities, well, they probably have the money, it's just in the wrong bucket. They just need to be more intentional with their utility costs and shift money to something else. I can also let you know that we have empirical data that will show that any church that has significant deferred maintenance is underfunded in general maintenance and staff. So stepping on to the fourth item here of staff, based on surveys that we've done as a company of nearly 400 churches and research done by IFMA. So if you're a facility manager, you may already know the name IFMA, which stands for it's meant for International Facility Managers Association. So it's a non-church-centric organization, but it's the largest facility manager association in the world with about 25,000 members. They do have what they call a community of practice that is geared towards houses of worship. And so their data reinforced our survey of the churches that you need one full-time staff member for every 25 to 35,000 square feet. Now, when we talk about a full-time facility staff employee, we're not talking about your janitorial staff. We're talking about general maintenance. So the people that are maintaining the building, if you have a 35,000 square feet building, you need a full-time person doing nothing but general maintenance. Now, I've been doing this long enough to realize that these numbers could come across as, oh Lord, what are we going to do? There's no way we're keeping up with all this. So there are things that can be looked at, and there's nuances to every situation. We won't dive into that deep, but if Nathan and I can ever help you think through what those things might be, just let us know. So the next bucket then is deferred maintenance. And these are just three definitions of what deferred maintenance is that I found on Google. I'm so thankful for Google. Between it and Wikipedia, I can get a definition of anything I need. But in essence, what this is saying is deferred maintenance, the real layman's terms, is it's things that you should have done that you've not done already. It's things that you've put off, things you've postponed. And generally what we find is the things that are postponed because there's not the budget dollars for them. I grew up in a pastor's home, and so I know what it's like to be in a small church where the pastor is the custodian, the pastor, the general maintenance. I mean, for many of my younger years, I dusted all the pews on Saturday. So I understand that there's some things that we have to deal with from a budget standpoint. But when we do not properly fund our general maintenance budget, we end up with deferred maintenance. And deferred maintenance is a tricky thing. Here's two quotes from two different research projects that were done by other organizations. One is every $1 in deferred maintenance costs $4 of capital renewal needs in the future. So for the $1 you don't spend today, it's going to cost you $4 down the road to take care of it. Now, this next one is a little alarming. If a necessary repair is deferred and allowed to remain in service until the next level of failure, whatever that might be, the resultant expense will be 30 times the early intervention cost. So let me give you an example. A number of years ago, I had a client that I had helped build a building, and came back several years later, and they said, hey, can you come look at our windows in our building? And at the time, they had gone with wood windows along the coast of South Carolina, which probably wasn't a wise decision, but it was budget driven. And so I'm looking at the windows. They're kind of looking a little worn, and they're not quite sliding up and down like they should. And I asked them when was the last time they caulked their windows. And they looked at me kind of confused. And obviously in 10 years, they had never caulked or painted their windows on the outside. Well, think of this. A tube of caulk, if you go to Lowe's or Home Depot, and you find a tube of caulk and buy it, on the back, does anyone have an idea of what a tube of caulk's warranty is? I think I can hear you. You're right, it's 1 year. So 1 year is the length of warranty for caulk. Well, how many of us actually go around and caulk our windows every year? Probably not very many of us. And if you had come to Charlotte, North Carolina about 2.5 months ago, I could have shown you my Florida room on the back of the house with all the siding having to be ripped off because I failed to caulk my windows and I ended up with wood rot behind it. So same thing happens in our church buildings. We don't caulk our windows. That is the first level of a failure, if you will, in this statement. If you don't caulk those on a regular basis, and it rains on the outside, and my guess is most of you live in a place where it does rain from time to time, where does the water go? You're right, it goes in the crack and down into the wall. So by the time that system, quote, that window system fails again, you may have wood rot, you may have drywall damage, you may have wet insulation, you may have mold. Now all of a sudden, instead of spending $2 or $3 for a tube of caulk, you're spending $10,000, $20,000 to fix it. You can see how deferred maintenance plays an enormous role in our facilities. You're looking at some pictures here of facilities that Nathan and I have personally been on doing facility condition assessments that show you deferred maintenance. That bottom left-hand picture is my favorite picture ever. It's of a church in Louisiana that decided it might be wiser to just run the roof over top of the air conditioning unit instead of replacing it. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, there's no splash block there. What happens over time if water keeps running there? Well, it's going to erode it. Eventually, it's going to undermine the sidewalk. And instead of there being only a hole that's muddy, now all of a sudden we're also going to have sidewalk that's going to be cracking or heaving or caving in that's going to be replaced. Or you could go down to the store and for $10 or $15 buy a splash block or a little piece of black pipe and fix that. That's deferred maintenance. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the National Education Association, basically the teachers union. They did a study, and they estimate that the cost of repairing and renovating of the school buildings and facilities, just to bring them up to modern standards, would be $322 billion. The U.S. Green Council was projecting that to bring it up to not only current building standards, but also health standards, it could be almost $542 billion. Again, wrap your mind around this. These are big, big numbers. So what's the big deal, Tim, and why are we even talking about schools? Well, there are only 98,000 public schools in America, and there are over 350,000 churches in America. You know, schools are an entitled entity. You know, they live off of tax dollars in most cases. Our ministries, we don't have that luxury. They've been entrusted to us by God, and we're going to be held responsible to steward those. So let's say, okay, Tim, the public schools are bigger. Okay, so maybe let's say they are bigger. I assure you, we're working with some churches right now that would dwarf any school building. But to your point, okay, there's many of them that are bigger than our churches. Let's say it's exactly the same amount of square footage. My guess is we're at least in that $300 to $500 billion of deferred maintenance. And for an organization that claims to be good stewards of God's money, if we have that much deferred maintenance, we're not being very good stewards. So that leads me then to probably one of the main reasons most of you joined us today, was to talk about capital reserve or life cycle planning. So before we dive into that, let me give you 3 facts to consider. The first fact is all buildings deteriorate at an annual rate of 1% to 4% a year. This is not unique to churches. This is not unique to shopping centers. This is unique to any built environment. This is just because of the natural rate of deterioration of natural resources and built products. And this number, just in case anyone has any skepticism, this number came directly from the International Facility Managers Association. So this was not something that Nathan and I just made up. The second fact is because everything is deteriorating, nearly every physical component of your facility will be replaced or have a major overhaul. You will replace every roof, every air conditioning unit, every bit of flooring. Now, you may not replace the foundation, and you may not replace structural steel, but nearly any other component will be replaced or have significant overhaul. You may not replace all of your conduit, but you may replace lighting at some point in time to make it more efficient. And the third fact is because all of it will be replaced, at some point in time, you're going to have dollars. I'm yet to find a roofing contractor that will replace a roof for sheep and goats in trade. So you're going to have dollars. Now, a little bonus fact, and this goes back to what we said a little bit earlier, is that if you don't keep up with the natural rate, it can more than double. And as we saw, 4 times, 30 times. It can be exponential depending on the building system and the component that you're looking at. So what is life cycle? I'm currently dealing with 2 aging parents. One's on hospice and one's actually in intensive care today. And so your prayers would be appreciated for my family and my parents particularly. But we talk about the cycle of life. And generally we talk about it when we're talking about human being life, or we're talking about it in plant life. But our buildings have a life cycle as well. When you think of the cycle of life, you start with planning, and that's the fun part. Oh, wouldn't it be fun to do something new? Then you design it, and everybody gets to pick out the red carpet that will go in the sanctuary. You build it, you commission it, and commissioning is just a fancy word for saying you've tested everything that's now in the building to make sure it's functioning the way it should function. And then you have facility management. So, seeing that I brought up the cycle of life related to humans, let's kind of break this down almost in terms of human life. So during stage 1, let's call that prenatal, that's the original construction time. So that's pre 1 year of occupancy. Obviously, you have nothing to maintain. It's being built. And so you not only do you not have general maintenance and janitorial and those kind of things, you also have capital reserves. However, I assure you that is the best time to start planning for it. Even when we work with churches that are looking to build a new building or renovate a building, I make the suggestion, start paying the mortgage to yourself a year ahead of time so you get used to what that payment's going to do to the rest of your budget. It's also the ideal time to plan, what is it going to cost me once I get into that building? I've got a client right now whose pastor and some of their financial people are just deeply frustrated with the fact that they're over budget in utilities and janitorial costs. Well, they just added 60,000 square feet, but nobody realized that you're going to have to pay utilities on that. So during this prenatal stage, that's the time to start getting ready for what it's going to cost when you're in a building. Everybody with me so far? Okay. So stage 2 is what I would call childhood. This green line is your routine maintenance. That's what we've been calling general maintenance in the other slides. So that routine maintenance really stays pretty consistent across the board. Other than general inflation up and down, your general maintenance should stay pretty consistent. But if you notice there, about halfway through that childhood stage, we start touching capital renewals. So if you have what's called DX HVAC equipment, direct expansion, the projected and predicted life expectancy of that is about 15 years, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. So somewhere in that childhood stage, you're going to start replacing HVAC units. Also, depending on the grade of floor finishes that you have, you may be replacing some flooring. If you decided to put on a rubber roof that only had a 10-year warranty, you're probably somewhere in that period of time going to be starting to look at replacing roofs as well. So in that childhood, you have some capital renewals that will start to be used. You step into adolescence, so that's 17 to 29 years, that number grows. And it's not growing just because you have more things that are reaching end of life, but in many cases, you're replacing some things for the second time. Again, if you have HVAC units that are meant to last 14 to 15 years, you may have replaced one during childhood and another one during adolescence. You step into then adulthood, that 30 to 49 years. The capital reserves are much, much bigger. Some items are being replaced now for the third time. If you have boilers and chillers, you're probably already into the replacement of those, which are large dollar items. You're also looking at some adaptive upgrades. You may be looking at ADA compliant things. You may be looking at major lighting changes to accommodate more efficiency. And then once you get into the ages of 50 plus, there's still continued adaptations, and you're going to have continued capital reserves, and then the cycle starts all over again. Because once you replace items in any one of these stages, that life of that item starts over again. So let me kind of bring some of this into reality as to what it really costs us to own a building. And we're going to look at this from what does it cost to own a building, not what does it cost to build or renovate a building. You can speak to most pastors and staff people, and they can let you know what it's like to build a building and the effort it takes, and sometimes they can even tell you what it costs. But I'm yet to find a lead pastor that can tell me what does it cost to own a building. And these are things that we need to take seriously before we ever build a building. So we did a study for a national magazine a few years back, and we made the assumption that we were building a 30,000 square foot building that cost us somewhere about $4.7 million. Of that 4.7, we borrowed $3 million. We did a 15-year amortization at 6% interest, but we paid it off in 7 years. So our total, what we would call cost of money, the interest you paid, was $1.1 million over that 7-year period of time. Then from that first slide that I showed you of operations, utilities, janitorial, and general maintenance, we have somewhere between $525 and $750 a square foot. Now you notice the little asterisk there. These numbers do not include managerial staff, grounds, or insurance. Yeah, but our facility manager is the guy that changes all the light bulbs, okay? Then whatever portion of your facility manager's time is done performing actual physical general maintenance or cleaning, then that would be allocated above. But if you have a facility manager that truly is just managing the facility and assigning work out to people, then that cost is not included here. What ends up happening in many churches is we give people a title of facility manager when really what they are is a facility maintenance person. And that's not to disparage anyone, it's just a different skill set. The reality is churches need both. You need facility maintenance and you need facility management. What we see more often than not, particularly with our friends at the church network, is the business administrator becomes the ad hoc facility manager and they put maintenance people on the floor. That is fine as long as the business administrator has facility management skills and has the time to do it. So my question to you all is, how many of you are business administrators and have time to take on another full-time job? Grounds and insurance we did not include either in this. I don't have a slide for this, but let me just let you know that if you're trying to figure out whether or not you're in line with your groundskeeping, we have found that somewhere between $5,000 and $5,500 per year per developed acre is a fairly reasonable and consistent budget. So if you have 100 acres, but only 50 of it's developed, then you multiply that times the 50 that's actually developed. So that's our operational cost. If I have operations, I have capital reserves that we're going to deal with a little bit later. And if I add those together, I've got somewhere between $625 and $950 a square foot. So we picked on the lower side of the median and said, let's just assume we need $7 a square foot. Well, again, going back to 30,000 square feet at $7 a square foot. That's $210,000 that I need for operations and capital reserves. So if we then assume a 40-year life cycle at 1.5% inflation, and 1.5 may be fine right now. My guess is in 5 to 10 years that's going to be too low. A couple of years ago it was probably too high. Let's just, for this instance, just say it's 1.5%. Well, that means that my initial cost was almost 4.7. My cost of money is about 1.1 million, but my cost of operations over 40 years is almost $13.5 million. Get your head wrapped around that for a minute. We get all uptight about what it costs us to build the building, to save a percent off of the contractor, to save $1 a square foot here and there, when we really should be looking at what can we do with our buildings to reduce operational costs. What that means is my $4.7 million building to build actually costs me just under $20 million to own over a 40-year period of time. And frankly, if you don't think your building's going to last 40 years, then don't build a building. Go buy a tent. Go run a shopping center. Do something else, because buildings were intended to last much longer than 40 years. So from a graphical standpoint, that blue section of the pie was the cost of construction. The red section is the cost of design and construction management fees. The yellow would be that cost of interest or financing, which leaves over 71% to be the cost of operation. That is a really big number. And it is the number that we constantly are having to explain to senior leadership as to the importance of taking care of what God has entrusted you with, because it is the biggest bucket of money that you'll ever have to have. So shortly after we did our assessment and it was published, we received a call from a facility management expert at State Farm Insurance in Chicago. They have a division up there that manages all their buildings across the country. They had just done a life cycle assessment of all their buildings that were between 40 and 50 years old. And they found that their operational cost was 80%. I then found a book called Life Cycle Cost Analysis that was written in 1965 by an architect. His premise was that it cost 85% for operations. Now, both of those used insurance and we did not. So our number, if you took 40 years of your insurance cost and added it in, we might be closer to that 80 to 85. Regardless of which number is accurate, it's a big number when you consider that the cost of owning your church facility is going to cost your church 71 to 85% of tithes and offerings just to keep it operating. So let's look at a scripture from 2 Kings 12, 4 through 15. Let every priest receive the money from one of the treasurers, then use it to repair whatever damage is found in the temple. So this verse right here is the indication that God wanted us to have a capital reserve, okay? Now, remember, I was a preacher's kid, so I can twist the scripture however I need to here to get my point across. So just stick with me. Don't shut me down yet. Verse 6, but by the 23rd year of King Joash, the priest still had not repaired the temple. That sounds like a deacon's meeting to me. Hey, we've been thinking about it. We've been talking about it. We've even been collecting some money, but hey, we've not done anything yet. No offense to my deacon friends out there. The priests agreed that they would not collect any more money from the people and that they would not repair the temple themselves. They did not do a DIY project. They took the money and they got professionals to come in and do it. Now, for those of you who are facility managers or maybe spend the majority of your time in facility management, you guys are pretty lucky, or gals, because the original facility managers were considered holy men. So I won't go through this verse today, but if you look at Numbers 3, 14 through 38, you will see a very detailed list of how God assigned the Levite, the high priest, to take care of the temple, the candlesticks, the tables, the pillars. The Levites, The high priests were the original facility managers. So long before there was a youth pastor or a children's director, they were facility managers. So again, I'm obviously biased, but it's my webinar, and so that's what I think. Okay. So what are capital reserves? The best definition I could find was an amount of money that a company or organization keeps in a special account for future needs. So there's three key points there. Number one is it's dollars. It's not the hope of dollars. It's not a promise for dollars. It is dollars set aside. And they're designated. They're in a special account. And I'm not saying you have to open up a separate checking account, but this money should be put into a line item of your general ledger or in a separate account that is designated, and it's not there just to cover the what if, we have a problem with the way we do ministry. This, again, we're going back to the inevitability. These costs are inevitable. If you have a shortfall in missions budget and you take it out of your capital reserve fund and the air conditioner breaks, then where's the money to replace the air conditioner? Well, you had it, but now you've put it someplace else. In addition, capital reserves are for down the road, not today. They're meant for the end of life, not for the things that you need to do on a regular basis to keep up with the natural rate of deterioration. It's not a rainy day fund. It is not the pastor's slush fund. It is not the place where you go if there's a downturn in offerings. So I've been asked the question this last year particularly, is there a good percentage of budget that a church should look at that is allocated to facilities? Many of you may be familiar with the percentage that many consultants will use as far as staffing. That if you're in the 45 to 55% staffing to total budget, that's an acceptable range. You really can't do that with facilities. And let me give you a couple of analogies that may help you in getting this point across. If you have an annual budget of $1 million and you have 100,000 square feet, but then the next year your annual budget drops to $500,000, but you still have 100,000 square feet, you still need as much money to maintain the building as you did when you had the higher budget, unless you shut down part of the building or stop using it. And even with that, you still have exterior maintenance you're going to have to deal with. So you cannot use a percentage of your budget as the means by which to determine what is the right amount of facility budget. You really have to look at it from a square footage basis, which is why all of our numbers are based that way. The other thing you've got to look at is what's referred to as the current replacement value. The 1 to 4% that I shared earlier is based on current replacement value. Current replacement value, and my guess is many of you, if not all of you, are doing a current replacement value for your insurance company on a regular basis. But it's basically, what would it cost us today to replace the building? You can't look at your rate of deterioration based on what you built the building for 30 years ago, but what would it cost us today to replace it? And my guess is most of you already have this information, so that would be a great place to start. So the question always asked us is, how much is enough? Well, if you want to have what I consider to be a shotgun approach without being real intentional, and you just want to start saving money, then anywhere from $1 to $3 a square foot annually is a reasonable number. We've run it both ways, from both being very intentional and specific to being more broad brush. And the 1 to 3 works. If you're a brand new building or a relatively new building, $1 a square foot may be enough because you've got a lot of years to save. If you have an older building, $2 is probably going to be more reasonable. If you have a building with deferred maintenance already, then you're going to need to be in the 3, maybe even 3+ range. So many of you may already be familiar with our eSpace software, but we have a free tool called a life cycle calculator. And if you're not already using it, we strongly recommend that you do. You can go to espace.cool, and it's wonderful to have a URL named after you. There's not a URL called .par that I'm aware of, but there is .cool.
Not yet.
If you go to, yeah, right. So if you go to espace.cool, go to products, scroll down to lifecycle calculator. It's totally free. But this will allow you to create capital groups. So I want elevators. I want my HVAC equipment. I want roofing. I want all my laptops, all my AVL equipment. You know, everything in your church building, whether it's part of the building or it's a piece of equipment, whether it's AVL, computers, so on, has a life cycle. So why not track it? You can list the piece of equipment. Where on my campus is it? What's its current replacement value? Meaning, if I had to buy it brand new today, what would it cost me? So my guess is you're sitting there going, I don't know. Well, most of us don't. And so there's two suggestions that I have. One, Google it, and you'll come up with a number that's going to be fairly reasonable. But I strongly suggest your best source of this information is from your subcontractors and your vendors. Whoever's currently maintaining your HVAC system, just have them tell you how many years of life do I have left in each one of these units, and what would it cost me today to replace it? So you can plug that data in. You can also pick then an inflation number. In this case, I had 3%, but you could pick any inflation number that you want. It will let you see then how much you need to replace it. So in this case, a $52,000 item over 20 years at 3% inflation per year, I need almost $94,000 in 20 years to replace that. Or more simply, about $4,700 a year needs to be set aside in a capital reserve fund. With this kind of a tool, you can now track that. You can watch it. You can even you can run summaries that will let you see year over year how much money is going to be coming out of it so that you guys can plan accordingly. But whether you use this or use an Excel spreadsheet or an abacus, whatever works for you, start with a tool. And instead of just saying $1 to $3 a square foot, become intentional with it. Get to know your building and what its true life cycle is. We also have an ebook on our website. It's also on the cfms.cool website to help you get started with establishing a capital reserve account. So that's the capital reserve portion. The fourth bucket that is part of this process. Remember, bucket number 1 is your operations. Bucket 2 is deferred maintenance. Bucket 3 is capital reserves. Bucket 4 is capital projects, major renovations, additions, new construction, repurposing of buildings. Those generally have their own set of budget set aside for it. Now, in a perfect world and in a best case scenario, you notice I only have 3 buckets, not 4. The bucket that's missing here is deferred maintenance. If we were spending the budget dollars we needed in general maintenance and in staff, and we were keeping up with the natural rate of deterioration, we would not have deferred maintenance. We would have operating costs, keeping everything running the way it's supposed to be running without things getting deferred until it's the end of life, and then you had money in your capital reserves to replace it, and you start all over again. Unfortunately, that's just not the case for most churches, but that, to me, is the goal. That's the goal that we should be reaching for as churches and as stewards of what God's entrusted to us. And I take that really seriously. I think it's really, really important for us to understand that we are not entitled to any of our facilities. Just because we became a member of a church doesn't make us entitled to having the facilities. In fact, in the New Testament, if you read the NIV, the word entrusted is used 55 times, and the word entitled is never used. So we're not entitled to our buildings. They've been entrusted to us, just like the Word of God has been entrusted to us and people have been entrusted to us. It's important for us to realize how critical it is to take care of what God's entrusted us with. So, Nathan, do we have some questions that I need to address?
Well, again, for those of you who who haven't done or haven't done it yet, you can send us questions via the question pane. And we're glad to answer any of those specific ones. I've been kind of answering them as we've gone. I think, though, talking about the tool again in the life cycle calculator is something that and how we can use it would be beneficial because, especially in how, as you said, you've got a lot of non-facility folks being responsible for these things. So when you talk about the life cycle, what kind of data or how can we use that to present it to other people? Do you have any suggestions?
And you're probably more the expert at this than I am, Nathan, because you actually lived it and were able to make your case at First Baptist Church of Belton. When Nate originally the life cycle calculator that I showed was actually an Excel spreadsheet that we've since abandoned when we put it into the software format because it can do so much more. But Nathan actually started to develop his, because when he took on his role and he started looking at the things that were at risk, things that were getting ready to have major replacement requirements, and noticed that there wasn't money to do it, he used his to show his finance committee what was at risk and what was it, $500,000 was going to be needed?
Yeah, we looked at everything that, according to the tool, said that we should have replaced it by this year. And then that was our at-risk amount. So we said, okay, here's everything that we know is coming up, but here's everything back behind us that we haven't done anything with. And you're right, it was about $500,000 that, and until you acknowledge the elephant in the room, you do kind of ignore it.
Yeah. And so, being able to have, that kind of empirical data to show your staff that, hey, this isn't just fun and games. Because here's one of the issues when it comes to capital reserves or capital replacements and renewals, is the least exciting capital campaign is to repair things that should have had money set aside for it in the first place. I have had several churches that I've worked with that have had some change in leadership, lay leadership, that have gone from an older to a younger, and those younger folks are looking at it going, you guys knew we were going to have to replace these air conditioning units. Why didn't you save for it? How many of us, haven't planned for some level of retirement? Well, you're going to retire your facility equipment as well. And unfortunately, we don't have Social Security to replace our air conditioning units. Right. And so we've got to be diligent with it. So where do we start? Number one is you're not probably going to be able to go to your finance team tomorrow and say, hey, we need to start saving $2 a square foot for capital reserves. They're going to look at you as if that, you've lost your mind. But start somewhere. And I think starting with a tool to know what the target should be, and then maybe you start with 25 cents a square foot the first year and jump it to 50 cents and the dollar and so on. You're going to have to grow your way into it, but also examine what your other areas, such as utilities. Are you spending more than $1.25 a square foot? If you are, there may be some efficiencies that can be looked at there that would then allow you to transfer money from that to either your general maintenance or your capital reserves.
Okay. I do have a question on, speaking of capital reserves, since you asked that. In your experience or talking with folks, is it worthwhile to put those reserve funds in an interest-bearing account?
Yes, absolutely. Because again, you're planning for the future. You wouldn't take your retirement money and put it in a non-interest-bearing account. You want it to grow over time. And so let me give you a prime example. We have a client right now that we're consulting with that's building a new building. They sold an old building, building a new building. When they moved out of their old building, this is a church of 250 people that had over $3 million of deferred maintenance. Matter of fact, the Sunday that they voted to sell the building and then build new with the proceeds, because their land was worth $1 gazillion, they had an 80-year-old woman that had to crawl on the floor to get out of the bathroom stall because the door wouldn't open. So we don't want Granny having to crawl on a bathroom floor anywhere, let alone in our church, to get out of the bathroom stall. And so that's how bad their building had become. So because they realized that, one of the first things we did is we did an analysis to say, if you built X dollars of square footage of new, and if you could obtain a 4% return on investment over a 20 to 30 year period of time, how much money would we need to set aside to always have the principal in place? So that church specifically took part of their money from the proceeds of the sale, set up an endowment that will be there, and Lord willing, they'll be able to, it will grow, and the money that is growing will be actually used for the capital reserves and not the principal amount. Now, most of you, many of you, maybe all of you, probably are not in that position where you could do that. But that's the kind of thinking is, if I can put aside, a dollar a year, and it grows at 2, 3, 4, 5% a year, in how many years now I've got more dollars. And so, yes, I would strongly suggest putting it in an interest-bearing account.
Okay. Next question coming in, and I can kind of speak to this too, is they've got multiple buildings built in different decades, from the 40s to 2010. When you do the life cycle calculations on each separate building or all into one, I can tell you with the tool that we have, our free life cycle calculator, you can separate it out by eras of construction, just as you upload that equipment. And I would recommend doing that, because a lot of your building components then will have similar, just the way you track it. It just makes sense to be able to separate it out. So you can also determine, another tool of this life cycle calculator is you can see if a building is deteriorating quicker than others, which can alert you to other issues or help you make a decision. Is it more economical to shut something down than continue to try to operate an older section or a particular building? Tim, I don't know if you have something you want to add to that, or thoughts on that as well.
Unless you're going to do a major overhaul of the buildings at one time to where they're all now in the same cycle, you're going to have multiple life cycles. And so to be able to track those separate, I think, are critical. So that's I totally agree with Nathan on that one.
Okay. We've had several people ask, can we get copies of this presentation? I will send everybody who's on, I will send a link so that you can view this presentation again, as well as handout sheet. And we will make it available on cfms.cool under the resources, which you can also view all of our previous webinars at that location as well.
Yeah. Matt asked a really good question about, what's the best way to explain leadership when they see millions of dollars in a fund that can't be touched for 20 years. And, when you have 120,000 square feet of roof, and at year 19 of the 20, you've got a lot of money sitting in the bank. You do. But if you can have a life cycle calculator tool or some other tool to let them see, hey, in this summary, I can show you that $1 million sitting there is going to be spent next year. And we're going to be able to spend that and get the new roof without you having to cut the budget in ministry. The other thing I use as an example, and some of you may think this is being catty or playing games, but think about this. If you're in Arizona and you apply it to your part of the country, in the middle of August, where it's 105 degrees, and your 100-ton chiller goes out in your sanctuary, how many weeks can you do ministry without that sanctuary? And that item is not something you go to Home Depot and buy. A 100-ton chiller may take 2-3 weeks to get. You've got to then schedule the crane, you've got to schedule the contractor and all the other things. It could be 3, 4, 5 weeks that you are out of business. Versus If you had already planned and you were watching the maintenance of something and you started seeing, hey, we're having more maintenance on this chiller in year 24 of a 25-year life, but you have the money set aside to buy it, instead of waiting until the failure, you go ahead and replace it. Because it's better to replace it than to throw good money after bad. The other thing is I'm a big fan of relamping worship centers all at one time. If you've got pews or sloped floors or stadium seating or anything that makes it very difficult to get a lift or some other way to get up to the lights, here's my recommendation. Determine how many hours on average is your building used per month, or the room, let's say your sanctuary. So we use our sanctuary 8 hours a week. 8 hours a week times 52 weeks, 460 or so odd hours. Then find a bulb that you want to replace it with, and I hope most of you will be moving towards LEDs. And maybe it's a 10,000 hour bulb. Okay, so how many years, based on our current usage, could those bulbs last? I generally then fudge and go about 20% less than the manufacturer says, because they're not always accurate or they take other things into consideration. And when you reach that level, you have the electrician come in with the lift for 1 or 2, 3 days, whatever it takes, and replace all of them. Because I can hear it now, people saying, yeah, but they're still working. Yes, but they won't be for long. And as a guest coming to a church that has half of their lights out in their sanctuary, it now looks like you don't care about the building, or you don't care about the people, or maybe you're in decline because you don't have money to take care of it. So there's things like that that I'm a big advocate of that will help you keep the building functioning the way you want it to function if you've got the money set aside to make the proper steps.
Okay.
Anything else, Nathan, that we need to cover?
I do, as I'm going through, just verifying. Let's see if they, yeah, so we've got one. It's a question, and we actually covered this in one of our webinars. Do we have a recommended for a management company, or do we find someone if they don't have somebody with facility management experience? The answer is there are companies you can outsource that to. What you have to keep in mind is churches are somewhat unique in some of the not issues is the wrong word, in some of the challenges and opportunities we face because we are ministry. So a professional facility management company, as long as they understand the mission, then you can outsource. If you can find someone who has those skills and who understands the heart and the ministry of what you're doing, you will generally have, I would say, a better experience. So I think that's how I would answer that. As far as recommending management companies, there's several out there. When you outsource something like that, or when you look for something like that, you have to make sure that you spend a lot of time finding out who they are and what their philosophies are. You cannot research them enough, or keep doing it. And
with outsourcing, the same thing applies with cleaning. I know Nathan talked about this a couple of months ago. There's some things that become philosophical for you as a church as to, do we want to outsource or insource? Do we want them to understand our vision and mission and be part of the team, or are we wanting just to have paid for work? We just hire them and they do the work and leave. And so then you have to think about, okay, if they're on staff, do I have benefits? If they're not on staff and they're part of an agency or a company, what's my termination opportunities there if I need to? So you've got to balance that with, how do you want to manage your facility, and what's a cultural type thing. One of our clients here in Charlotte, they want all their facility staff to be members of their church. It's a large enough church that they've got some qualified people that were in the church already, but other churches don't have that luxury. So you've got to think through what fits you all culturally.
Okay. And then one of the final questions I'm seeing here is starting the design stage of a new building, new facility. As churches are looking, what's something that they should consider that would help operational costs?
Yeah, so the couple of things that will help with operational costs. The first one is think through what things can be automated right from the get-go. HVAC, door locking, lighting, different things like that. Things that many of you probably spend a good bit of your day having to run around, turn on, turn off, unlock, lock. What are those things that can be done through automation that you don't have to then spend time on? So that's number one. The second is, how am I going to maintain this building? So if they have a 40-foot chandelier, how am I going to get that to clean it? How am I going to get a lift or a cherry picker through the doors? Can I get a lift through my doors? Be thinking about when they put in the HVAC units, can I even reach the filter door? Or is it covered over, or do I have to get on my head and spit quarters in order to get to the even filter door? So think about those type of things, and then evaluate and ask the contractor up front, give me life cycle projection for this product versus that product. If you're looking at carpet, well, what's the difference between carpet and LVT, which stands for luxury vinyl tile? What's my life cycle? What's the care cost of it? There's the aesthetic part of it that has to be taken into account. But as a facility professional, to be asking the questions about, hey, I'm the guy that's got to take care of this, or the gal that has to take care of this. I need to know that these are the things that need to be considered. And if we've decided to make a budget decision to buy the cheapest carpet known to mankind, which is fine, that's a value decision, just know you're going to replace it much sooner, which means you're going to have more capital reserves sooner than you would have if you went with a higher quality product. So those are the type of things to be considering, Gary, I think, as you guys are going forward in planning.
You see there the question on what's reasonable for them to charge. You're looking at what we've talked about in this webinar. That's based on national data, by a lot of it compiled by IFMA, the International Facility Management Association. Those are the professional facility managers, and that's where that number comes from. So that's what's reasonable to expect to see a range in that. Obviously, if it's way lower than that, run away. And if it's a great deal higher, unless you're getting on-site full-time management in addition to the maintenance, you need to be aware. But I would look at the figures that we put there for what it costs to maintain. That's what any reasonable professional company would be charging as well.
Yeah, agreed.
So I think we've got all the questions that have been sent. If you have a question that we didn't get to, or we didn't get answered, please reach out to us at cfms@coolsolutionsgroup.com. We'll definitely get those and respond back, get you an answer. And we love doing these webinars. And next month, we have a representative from U.S. I'm going to say it wrong. It's Department of Energy, not Department of Justice, Department of Energy. We're talking about Energy Star for congregations. So that one low-hanging fruit that we can all look at are utility costs. This webinar is going to talk about and share some of those free resources that are available to churches to help save some money. So again, that's next month's webinar with Energy Star for congregations. It's on December 13th. It's a little sooner than normal rotation, but if y'all can be there, I hope you can attend that one as well.
Sounds great. Well, thank you all for attending, and know that Nathan and I are available to take questions after the webinar as well, as he said, at cfms@coolsolutionsgroup.com. Happy to provide any information that we can.
All right. Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of the week.